Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Politics Today, where we'll be discussing the tragic murder of a much-loved Member of Parliament, Sir David Amess. And in this programme today, I'm joined by Dave Berlays from Halford House, together with Alistair Scott, who's the UK Director of Joseph Storehouse. So, gentlemen, welcome to the programme. I'll start off with you, Dave. It's very sad state of affairs that such a loved Member of Parliament that really did stand up for Christian values. He stood up for our Judeo-Christian heritage. He defended Israel in the House of Commons. So everything that we kind of support and believe was really shown through his action as a loved Member of Parliament, and then to realise that his life was taken so quickly at a surgery meeting where it was open to the public by a Somali Islamist is shocking for our democracy, is it not?
Yeah, it really is. We should encourage our viewers to pray for the family. He's got 5 children. A wife he leaves behind, and obviously politics aside and all the other things, at the end of the day he was a father and a husband, and sometimes we forget that in political discourse, that these are just people, ordinary people like you and I with families, and yet they also should be safe. They also should be protected, and we'd expect them to be safe. Obviously we saw the murder of Joe Cox not so long ago. But it wasn't just, that was obviously just out in the streets campaigning. This time it was at surgery, but that wasn't the first time, and also not the only Christian MP. Stephen Timms was attacked who is also a Christian, a Labour MP, was attacked in his surgery at the time as well. So it's not like it's never happened before. And again, I think that was an Islamic extremist who attacked Stephen Timms. We have seen these things happening. We have seen really that we as a society are not as safe. There was a time where we thought, well, you know, there were limits. There were limits what would happen. We had IRA years ago, and that was a time where people felt unsafe. And again, we're in that time where the unexpected seems to be happening, and that talks to us about end times, and the Bible talks about perilous times. And dangerous times, violent times, those words could be translated. And so we feel like we're living in those ages. The news seems to bear that out. We've got all these things going on in the world, in Lebanon and all these other countries, and Iran and Israel. And yet even in our own country, supposed liberal democracy, we see MPs being murdered. We expect them to be safe. So it's a reflection on where we are, I think, in not just society, but in the prophetic time clock.
Yeah, and Alistair, I mean, we see in our media that our members of Parliament go through an awful lot of scrutiny, particularly on what side of the political debate that they're on. We see big arguments and discussions and what have you, but to actually take the life of a very popular member of Parliament, it is truly shocking, and I think it's shocked the nation to the extent that here's a guy that opened up his constituency to meet this Somali-born Brit when he wasn't even in his own constituency. And it just makes you think that how safe are our members of Parliament, and do they need greater protection? Because if the terrorists think that they can then drive a wedge between our elected officials and the public, then we start to have a breakdown in democracy and a breakdown of that such important relationship between members of Parliament and the public and the constituents they represent.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, like Dave just said, you know, our thoughts and our prayers really do go out for the family. And I was amazed of their gracious statement that they released after the event, in the midst of the shock and the trauma of what they've experienced as a family. But yes, I mean, like, we know this is going on, and on a day-to-day basis, what you're hearing from MPs is that they get these threats on their media services, you know, through WhatsApp or whatever media people are using to threaten them with life and death if they disagree with them, which is kind of a sad reflection of our society at this time. Yeah. And for sure, I mean, I think for David, and the MP David, he was doing what he loved doing. I mean, he truly was a constituency man, and he ran the causes for Southend and his district greatly for the people. That's why he was so popular across, you know, it didn't matter which party you represented. But you know, the question, as you put earlier, is we need to really find ways of protecting these politicians. It's Joe Cox, as we heard, was brutally murdered just outside in the streets on a way to a surgery. And for this particular episode, what's made it worse that he actually held his surgery in a church hall. You kind of it's a frightening thought that he was open to allow people to come and just queue up to see him. Now, I mean, obviously that will have to be looked at for wisdom for the future, that there is some kind of screening going on. I know it does happen in certain areas, but I guess Southend was one of those areas where he felt it was a safe place to be. He'd been there nearly 40 years representing that constituency, and he desired, I mean, one of the MPs I remember speaking last week said, you know, I think it was Priti Patel maybe, who said something along the lines that, you know, he was taken doing what he loved best, which is serving his constituency and his people. Very sad. What a waste of a life, because truly he is, and he was a believer. He was a strong pro-Israel believer too, and he was a regular churchgoer who believed in the Lord. So it's a great miss for us in Parliament that we have one less fear of the Lord parliamentarian there, and we just have to pray whoever comes in next would be much the same, with a desire to serve his people, but with a heart after God. So yeah, very, very, very sad to hear this, and something needs to be done. And obviously there'll be a lot of debate going on. The great thing, the good thing out of every bad there is good, isn't there, was the way the party was united as they honoured him for his brilliant work as a parliamentarian. It was good. He was a righteous man serving his people with a right heart, and that's a very important thing to remember. And we do. We need to continue to just lift up his family, pray for them to have peace in what must be the most difficult circumstances.
No, absolutely. And I suppose the big question is security. Will security have to change now? And you know, if we go into Parliament or Portcullis House, it's an armed fortress there. You know, with it almost feels like an airport. You have to go through an X-ray machine. You have to take your belt off, your shoes off, phones and everything else, just to be able to see and meet with an MP. So it's a lot safer there. But the question is that the MPs are then vulnerable at their constituency meetings. They hold once a week on a Friday, where there isn't such security. I know that our Home Secretary Priti Patel was saying that there will be, they'll provide police and protection for our MPs. But isn't there a danger with doing that we then make MPs less accessible to the public? And in doing so, we then damage our democratic institutions and our democratic way, and there's a wedge between our elected officials and the public. What do you think is the best way to keep MPs safe, but at the same time allowing the public access to them?
Yeah, I think some of the MPs have the constituency surgeries in buildings that already have security, and I think that may be a smart move. It does mean that they're in places that they won't be in church halls again. You know, either that or they put these sort of metal detectors in on the way in. But it seems practical to have them in buildings that already have security. There's no extra cost. The infrastructure is already there. It's already paid for by and funded by the taxpayer already. So that may be one simple change. It's not a very good change, because we like them as close as possible. We like them not behind all the security. We don't like to walk past an armed police officer. We don't like to see armed police on our streets. It's not what our nation is like. Generally, the police don't carry guns, and yet we see increasingly the need and how quick those armed officers got to the scene. They're often in cars and we're unaware of them, and we are rapidly going down that road, and sadly it's necessary. And I don't think there's any avoiding it. I don't think there's any, I think we can't live in a world where we wish it was better. We can certainly pray that it'd be better, but currently that's where we're at. These are the threats that we face, are real and present, and so we do have to take steps. You're right though, people need to be accessible. MPs need to be accessible. I tried speaking to my local MP. It's not very easy. She's not very accessible. I'd like her to be more accessible to me. But I think that was a reflection in something that's changed. You have to make an appointment. You have to, and generally she runs coffee mornings, so it's a group thing rather than a one-to-one kind of conversation where you can raise issues. So I think that's a sad step back, and I think the balance needs to be that we can access our MPs, that we can raise our issues, that we can do it face to face, because the last thing we want, actually, some of the reasons why people are so aggressive on social media is because they would never say that to someone's face. Yeah. They would never talk like that in person. They are hiding behind a keyboard and they are frustrated and angry. And actually, a lot of these people who are doing these things would never dream of carrying them out and carrying out those threats. And they're not really a risk. The real risk is the Islamic extremists that we've seen at work here. And actually, I feel like the debate that's been on our media recently about this thing, and everyone should be kind and say nice words, we're actually not looking at the real problem. And the real problem is this Islamic extremist threat, and that's really where our MPs are a real danger from, and the general public at large as well.
Which is a very good point that Dave raised, and that's the question of dealing with the ideology itself, the Islamic extremist ideology. We hear that this Somali terrorist was inspired by John Chaudhry, the known hate preacher, from watching one of his videos on YouTube. So surely social media companies and these tech giants need to do more to stop the incitement, which then leads to the recruitment of these impressionable young men into a life of kind of terrorism and violence, whether they're recruited by Al-Qaeda or from ISIS. It's still that grooming that takes place and that radicalization that takes place. But if we can somehow cut off those sources of radicalization, then it's going to be safer. And according to the newspapers as well, they're saying that this problem has been made worse by the lockdown. So the lockdowns we've had meant we haven't faced any terror attacks, but what it's done is it's radicalized a large number of young, impressionable Muslims to carry out future terrorist attacks. And our MI5 and our security services are struggling to keep up and monitor the amount of people now that pose a national security threat. So how important is it that the government really tackles this as a source, like David said, and stops the incitement and the poison really coming from the Islamic hate preachers and others who inspire them to carry out such violent, evil attacks?
Yeah, obviously, it needs really working on, and I would think that the government would say that there is a lot going on that we don't know of, because fortunately, these cases are rare. They're not happening on a monthly basis or a weekly basis or whatever. So there must be an intelligence service that's working through and stopping most things before they start. But I guess you're never going to have a perfect system, and that is a challenge for every government. You know, every party, they really do need to unite and see the risk. And you know, we talk about an Islamic attack, but anyone who is fundamental or totally radical and has these extreme views are a risk to somebody, particularly for those who are in the media, in the front line, like our MPs. But yeah, so it's, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the days when you could walk through an airport with not much security, and it had to change. You know, 9/11 changed everything, as they say. And so I think you have to adapt to be more secure in everything you do, to keep our MPs protected, because we've chosen them to represent our lives, you know, and they need their lives secure. So I think wisdom would say you have to change the way that these surgeries are run, and there has to be some form of security to stop people just turning up unchecked with knives in their back pocket, willing and able to just attack an innocent man who is there to really serve the public. So yeah, I think life has to change for the politicians. We don't want to hear in 5 years' time again of another attack on a politician, no matter what our opinion is. We have no justification to come against somebody else in any form of attack on their life or injury or whatever. We've got to be able to speak one-to-one, get your point across, but not have this desire to kill somebody because they don't agree with what you. I mean, looking at this man himself, his family, his father, actually fled from Somalia because under threat of death because of the extremists around him, and he's come here to this nation, lived, as far as we know, a law-abiding man, everything, and then his son been in school in this, he went in school, lived in the same area where I went to school myself, and yet he has been radicalized. I used to work in the prison services a lot in the good old days where Christian ministers were allowed in, and now when you go in there, they are almost totally filled with clerics with extreme views from Islam, unfortunately. I don't want to single that out, but that's what the situation is. So even from within the sort of prison services, there's this kind of extreme radicalization that's going on, and it's happening, unfortunately. You know, anyone who is wanting to be led in a certain direction can easily find people who will be with them, who will train them, equip them in the wrongdoing. So yes, our government, our police forces, we do need to be more wise, and us generally in the public also. We need to be more aware of what's going on. As believers, of course, we know we need to pray. We need to pray, and God can show things and intervene in things before they actually happen. Unfortunately, this one case has happened, and it's very sad to see the effect of it. But I think it highlights we need to be a nation that is more aware that there is a danger from within. You know, I've said this so often before, it's more difficult to deal with an enemy within than it is an enemy across the water or in another nation, because there's a border, there's land between you. But when they're your next door neighbor and appear to be very friendly and wave to you and all the rest, those are the ones who are the greatest risk to people who are in positions of authority. And, you know, we do need to pray for our politicians. They are in authority. They are the ones that, according to Romans 13, they're in authority because the Lord allows it. And we need to be aware of that. And whether we agree with their politics or whether their views, we still have to understand God has placed them there, and we need to be people who secure them in our prayers. So it's a challenge. It's a big challenge for all of us as believers, as well as the politicians, the police force, and everything else that's involved.
And Dave, when we look at the man, David Amess, he represents very few members of Parliament that were still willing to stand up for Judeo-Christian heritage. Yeah. We understand that he was pro-life. He was against a lot of this very liberal agenda that is so rife in our media. That he stood for the church, the Roman Catholic background he comes from. He also stood and defended Israel and the Jewish people as well. And he was also an extremely popular member of Parliament across both sides of the House, with the opposition as well. But it also raises a very important question, I think, and that is to say that, yes, Christians can be members of Parliament, can hold on to traditional family values, can hold on to defending Israel and the Jewish people, and still be an MP and still be liked. And of course, there's a big difference between him and our Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who just wants to do everything to be liked and everything to be popular. But he stands aside from that and is determined to represent truth and to represent kind of a biblical heritage and values, probably a dying breed of members of Parliament. But what encouragement should this give younger people watching who have aspirations to be a member of Parliament? That means you don't have to give up on your values, you don't have to compromise in order to with your Christian faith, and that you can be bold and strong and yet still be liked because of the way that you treat people and deal with people.
Yeah, I think there's a very good lesson to learn from David Amess's life. He's a man who has strong convictions, and we desire that from politicians, certainly as believers, people who stand up for pro-life, people who be pro-Israel, who speak up even though it's not popular. But he did it in a winsome way. And I think all Christians need to work on this. You know, our lives on social media, we talked about it earlier. How do we communicate the truth? How do we communicate our convictions? How do we do it in a way that we don't compromise, but we do say it in a gracious way, in a winsome way, to win people over to the viewpoint, and not just aggressively go in shouting our mouths off sometimes, which is what sometimes we see happen. He was a politician who seemed to be able to get his point across, get his view across strongly, without compromise, but yet in a way that was winsome, in a way that he didn't upset people. Not what he said, it wasn't the way he said it that upset people. We can easily upset people in the things we say, and that will happen. We can't avoid that, but we can avoid upsetting people in the way we say things, the manner and the approach we take. And so I guess for advice for our young people or people interested in entering politics is, yes, it will be challenging. Yes, it will be difficult, because people do not like the views that are espoused by believers, particularly pro-life, particularly if you have a particular view on traditional marriage and things like that, that's not popular today. And it will be difficult, but it's not impossible. He wasn't seeking a career politician. He wasn't seeking to be in government, in the cabinet. And so it's easier to be a backbench MP and hold your convictions. It's harder when you get on the front benches, and we've seen that sadly with some believers who have found that the fire is much greater as they get to the front benches. But it's encouraging, at least, that the backbenches are still very much open to believers.
Yeah, which is really important, isn't it? To pray for our remaining members of Parliament who do hold to a Christian faith and do hold to kind of biblical values, and there's not many of them. But in terms of, you could see how visibly upset Boris Johnson was, our Prime Minister as well, and knowing how far the Conservative Party or government have gone from, say, the views of David Amess and what he stood for. Maybe it's a reminder to the Conservative Party that you can still hold on to those values and still be popular, and still have that respect, because we saw the outpouring of complete love upon him and his family from his constituency, saying he would do anything. He would turn up for a faith meeting or turn up to the school for a school play. He was ready there to serve his constituency, to help them. And of course now he's fulfilled his political ambition of getting Southend-on-Sea to be recognised as a city, which he campaigned for decades as a Member of Parliament. So it just shows you, if you connect with people and be a people person, you can make a massive difference, can't you?
The fact that he had served that constituency for the time he did showed, like Dave said, he was a man of conviction. We do love people of conviction, but not being a person of condemnation. So he accepted that in his constituency there were people of various persuasions politically, and he served them as a group. He was truly, when we talked about Boris Johnson, and sure, watching the reactions of all the leaders, not just him, Keir Starmer was the same. They were so touched, hurt, whatever the word is, by what they'd seen. And I think in some ways, yes, I was talking with my wife this morning before travelling out here, and we were saying, sometimes something like this just brings people up to a point of realization. Look, the things that we separate us are not as important as the things that unite us. And the thing that unites every government, because even biblically, the government's first priority is always the welfare of its people, not the welfare of your political people, but the people in the nation. So I think this can work in a positive way, where I think the government does right across the board. The parliamentarians do need to unite and look at a solution which brings security. And we talk about the young people. We mustn't allow the enemy to win in this situation. Absolutely. That's why the politicians mustn't go into sort of locking themselves in rooms and so on. And for young people coming in, let's if you've got a conviction to serve, the nation and stand in a position of authority, don't allow this to sway you, but let's really believe that our government and our forces will gather together and put in as secure as it possible can do. Nothing's going to be 100%. You know, you can't walk across the road and guarantee you're going to get the other side. It's not 100%, but you can make it as safe as possible by looking both sides of the road and crossing in the right places. And I think this is the big challenge now for us as a nation, is to make sure there is security around our politicians. And as Christians, let's pray. Doesn't matter who they are. If they are representing your constituency, our duty is to pray for them.
Absolutely, and that's you've just asked my my question, which is great, Alistair. We're down to 3 minutes of the programme. You know, Dave, you're an intercessor, been involved with Intercessor for Britain. Maybe this is a kind of stark reminder to our viewers that we need to lift up our members of Parliament to pray for them, because their lives are in danger. They do put themselves on the line. Their whole life is devoted to public service. Yes, they also want the power and the responsibility that comes with it, but it's essential that we keep them in prayer, and also our government in prayer, isn't it not?
Yeah, it really is, and they have a tremendous amount of influence. They can really make a big difference for the nation. We've seen great leaders from different parties in our nation that have a really positive effect. We've also seen the negative, and the problem sometimes out of this is that there can be bad legislation made really quickly. And one thing I'd encourage us to pray is that the online harms bill, that it doesn't get extended too far. They often, in an effort to crack down on Islamic extremism, go too far and will clamp down on things that will affect Christianity and people who would never dream of this sort of thing. So we do have to pray very much for our leaders. Pray when tragedy happens that it shakes them. I think they were shaken. It was interesting, some of the comments that Boris Johnson came out with, talking about the resurrection, the thinking about it, the afterlife seemed to suddenly strike him, even in that moment. You could see it on his face. Let's really pray that the Lord breaks through into the hearts of some of these politicians, and that they would really be willing to make a stand for truth and righteousness, and that they could gather and unite around that rather than be divided over silly political games, which sadly we see sometimes.
Definitely. And Alistair, isn't it important that we've got within 20 seconds that we engage with our MP, that we know our MPs, and also to pray for them?
Yes, very, very much so. I'm a great believer in getting as much opportunity to encourage them, but also to challenge them, because they need to know what the Christians think in their constituencies as well. So yes, take every opportunity to pray for them daily, as the Holy Spirit prompts, but get in there and get to see them on certain issues that are important to us as believers.
Absolutely. So, Alistair and Dave, thank you so much for being my guests on this week's edition of Politics Day, and I want to thank you for watching this programme at home. It's so important that we keep the family of David Amess in our prayers during this horrible, shocking moment where they've had their husband and father taken away from them, and also a great member of Parliament who stood up for our Judeo-Christian values, who stood up for Israel, who stood up for the unborn. And we need more righteous members of Parliament like him to be in Parliament, that are not going to be compromised with the quest for power, but instead stand firm on the truth. So I want to thank you for watching this week's edition of Politics Today.